Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk today about adding accessibility to the development process. I'm really excited to be here and really happy that so many of you have come. In this session, I'm going to explore how Visual Studio can be used for adding accessibility checking and how we can use Azure DevOps. So that'll be my journey using Azure DevOps and my journey automated testing with Cypress. Just a little bit about me. My name's Rachel Breeze, and you can get hold of me on Twitter at BreezeRachel. My DMs are open. I'm a senior developer at Nexer Digital. I am a C# Umbraco back office developer, not a front end developer. But having said that, I believe, and I will show, that everyone on the team is responsible for making their websites and applications accessible. Even as C# and back office developers, our code does interact with the front end. So the first step for getting accessibility into your development process, if it isn't already there, is to share with your team, your peers, your bosses, and your clients that accessibility matters. And there's worldwide, there's many laws that will cover accessibility. In some countries, it's just public sector sites that should be accessible. In other countries, it's public sector and private sector sites. So it's well worth checking the laws against your country. And in the EU, you've got the EU directive that applies, but you'll also have laws at a country level that will apply around accessibility. So that's one reason that accessibility matters. According to the World Wide Web Consortium, there's about 1 billion people worldwide with disabilities. So those are a couple of reasons for having accessibility. But for me, creating products using inclusive design principles and creating them so they're accessible just makes sense. You've spent time developing your web service, your application, and your website. So why not invest the time and the money to make sure that everyone can use it? By doing that, not only are you making it usable for everyone, but by building for accessibility, you're aiding in search engine optimization, and more people will see it, and therefore you've increased the reach and the number of people who will engage in your app that way. But the most important people that accessibility matters to are the end users. And Nexer, as part of this year's Global Accessibility Awareness Day, have created a video, and we've created it in conjunction with Molly Watts, who you might know from the Umbraco Accessibility course. And this video explains what access means to our end users. I've got a short clip I'm going to share with you.
I'm Neil Milliken. I'm head of accessibility at Nexer. I'm dyslexic, ADHD. I use technology every day to help me cope with the demands of my job and everyday life. We need to be inclusive in how we design, deliver, and conceive of technology. When we do so, we're making better products for everyone. You're also making better products for me. Accessibility is a civil right. It's a quality in products. It's so much easier to use and enables me to do things that otherwise I would really struggle with.
So the video is about 6 minutes long in total, and it's well worth a watch, and I'll share a link on Twitter after my talk. Now, whilst the talk is about adding accessibility at the development process, so in Umbraco terms that might be the build part of the development, accessibility actually starts well before then. In fact, if you're trying to add it in for the first time, the W3C have created an accessibility roles matrix that shows the different roles involved that might be involved in a team, and broken the responsibility out across the different criteria. I do want to emphasize that it is a team requirement to create accessible websites and applications. It's not a siloed process. And one of the things that's important in content management systems, and this is shown here, is that we include our authors in helping to create accessible content. And so we need to work with them to explain our implementation to ensure that they create accessible content. And before we begin development, accessibility actually starts at the prototyping stage. Now, many people say that prototypes aren't accessible, and they're correct. A piece of paper isn't something that someone can interact with. Actual people can interact with, but it doesn't always create accessible HTML. And Derek Featherstone, who's the Chief Experience Officer at Level Access, has done a great series of tweets explaining how you can test for accessibility as early as prototyping. I'll share the link after the talk, but I wanted to highlight a few of those things. He shows how voice recognition, you sit down with someone who uses voice recognition and ask them how they may accomplish a task. How you can work with someone who has low vision to see if the colours in the prototype work for them. And you can work with someone who uses a switch to see if the size of the controls and the space between them works for them. From prototyping, you'll probably move into HTML. So at this point, your designs should have been checked for accessibility. So does the color contrast work? Are the fonts correct? And so on. And you'll have worked with your end users to get an idea of the interactions that are needed. So then when you move into HTML, you know a lot is accessible, but you still need to continue to test your HTML to make sure it's accessible. And a few things that should remember as you're developing HTML and CSS is that semantic HTML should be used for assistive technology to work. For example, if it's a button, then use a button. And then another thing, it's very easy to get caught up in the moment when you're collaborating with your clients. So they say, I don't like this piece of HTML here, can we move it here? And it's very easy to move that around using CSS or JavaScript. But you do need to ensure that the visual order and the semantic order actually match when you've completed your HTML. And the final thing that we should also check that often gets overlooked is that the HTML is valid. And this ensures that the site meets one of the WCAG rules, the robust rule, that the site has valid HTML. And this is so that user agents, including assistive technologies, can accurately interpret the content. So our front-end developers may use a linter for testing the HTML. But back office developers, we've got a couple of tools that we've got available to us. So W3C have a markup validation service that we can use, and it allows you to validate by URL, by file upload, and by direct input. I'll just show you this now. Deque have written an inaccessible website, and I'll just grab the URL from that and put it back into the validation box and check the URI. And what that's doing now is it's going off and running rules. This does occasionally return false positives, but it's a nice way to check that your HTML is valid. Visual Studio 2 offers this functionality. So in Visual Studio, and I'm using Visual Studio 2019, if we've got an error in our razor markup, we have, if I delete the body, it says you've got an underline up here, so the body tag's underlined with an error that we can see when we hover over it. It says element body requires end tag, and I've set it up so that that's a warning. So we've got a warning as well, and we've also got in the screen at the bottom left details of warnings as well that we can go to and resolve. I'll just put that back in. But if I go to tools, if you're not seeing that, the way you can configure it is go to tools, options, the search bar, and type in HTML. And then if you select the advanced HTML option, you can see the validation settings here for you to be able to test it. So that's the start for creating accessible HTML, but we also want to, going the wrong way through the tools, sorry. We also want to validate in Visual Studio the actual HTML against accessibility conformance. So Visual Studio's got a web accessibility checker extension, and you can install that as a standalone feature or as part of the Web Essentials toolkit. And it works with Browser Sync and Web Essentials to allow you to test your HTML in Visual Studio. I've downloaded the extension already, but I will show you that now. So this is a piece of HTML, and I can go to Tools, and you should see at the top here I've got the Check Accessibility option. I can click on that. I can then select the levels of conformance I want. I click Validate, and I get the errors listed. And you can then see how critical the error is. And I've left in the manual checklist, so these blue icons here, because I wanted to show you that not all issues can be resolved programmatically, automatically, that you do still need to do manual checks. What you can do when you see an error is double click on that error and fix it like you would normally using C#. However, that checker doesn't work on Razor, so I've gone to my Razor view now. I'm clicking Tools, and there's no Check Accessibility option. Because Razor's dynamic, the only way to check accessibility of Razor within Visual Studio is to run Visual Studio. So I'll load up your code in your browser. So I'll just do that now. I am, for those of you who are familiar with the different starter kits, I'm using Paul Seal's starter kit. I have hacked it to get most of the accessibility errors here. A big shout out to Paul Seal for saying that I could use it, so thank you. And this is loaded now, and we can see the page, and we can now, if I move the page out of the way and load the errors list, we can now see that that accessibility icon is shown in the errors list, and we can expand the error out, and it shows us how critical the error is, the URL that the error is on, and where the error is. And also importantly, it's got a link back to the site to show how the what the error is and how to resolve it. And these are important things when you're coming to resolve errors. You need to know how critical the error is, where the error is, what the error is, and how to resolve it in order to prioritize a lot of fixes. And these are things you'd also expect to see in an accessibility audit. So if we go back to the website and we move on to another page, we can then rerun the checks on that site by going to the Visual Studio extension plugin in Chrome and clicking Run Accessibility Checker. Or back in Visual Studio, we can click on the browser link next to that, click Web Accessibility Checker, and click Run Now on all browsers. And this browser link lets you run sites across multiple browsers. So this is a nice way to get feedback across multiple sites. And you can see again that we've got a list of errors come back, and you can see that some of these are the same across the two pages. So what this means is it's probably in the footer or the header. And by resolving issues in the header and the footer, we've had a good chance of it impacting the accessibility across the site. So once we've resolved all those issues within Visual Studio, obviously we'll do a deployment. And a deployment then means that someone else is going to have to check the accessibility. And we want to make sure our deployment is still accessible. So one way to do that is to use the Azure DevOps Accessibility Checker task. And this supports a number of different levels of conformance. And this is where I'm hoping the demo gods are with me. So I'm in my DevOps pipeline now. I'm going to add as a release pipeline. So what you want to do with accessibility checking automated tests is run them at the end of a deployment. I'm going to just show you how you add that to a new test very quickly. So I'm going to create a new release pipeline. And you're going to have to imagine that I've got all my other deployment steps going through. So very quickly add a new stage for checking accessibility. And now we add the task in by clicking on the task option and clicking on the plus sign. So on the plus sign, you can see that I've got this accessibility checker task loaded straight away. It may not be there for you, and you may need to add it into your organization if it isn't already installed. If I click on add now, it will load in the accessibility checker in the pipeline, and then I can configure it. So you give it a name, you say the URL you want to run it against, and you can set the accessibility levels that you want to run, and also if you want to disable any. And then the next time you do your deployment, that will report any accessibility issues. And in true Blue Peter style, I have got one that I've created earlier. So this test is run is the one that I've just run. I showed you how to create, and it's come back as a failure. And we can see that by clicking on it, we get a list of the errors. It's run against the Deque page that we saw before. You get a list of the errors, but you can also click in and you can get more details of the errors, helping you determine how to prioritize them. So it says whether they're critical or serious, what rule's been broken, and where the error is on the page. So your URL needs to be accessible to Azure DevOps. And obviously, as you probably saw, you'll need to create a task per URL you want to check. And it does have a few configuration things you need to set up, and it will only work on a virtual machine or a server. So I know as developers, we like to play before we read instructions. In this particular case, do read the instructions before you go and install it. For me, because it had you had to configure it on a per page basis, and because it was restricted to pages that are in front of a logon, so I can't test accessibility once I've logged in, there was a few limitations to the task. So I decided that we would look at automated testing, and because I wanted to impact as many sites as possible, I wanted to automate testing using smoke testing. Basically, I wanted to be able to check the site map and use that to explore what the accessibility of a site. So there's two options available. Well, there's many options available, but developers will either work with Cypress or Selenium. I chose to work with Cypress mainly because Umbraco has already written wrappers for Cypress, which means moving forward we should be able to automate building of pages and testing them for accessibility rather than doing a smoke test. And the use of Cypress, because it's installed using npm, the use of Cypress means that it can be used by front-end and back-end developers, regardless of the development environment we're in. Excuse me, my neighbour's just going off on the motorbike. So it can be used by front-end and back-end developers, regardless of the IDE they're in. And because it's npm, we can add it to the Azure DevOps build. So automated accessibility testing using Cypress, it utilizes Axe Core. Axe Core is open source. The aim is it returns 0 false positives, and it's actively supported by Deque systems. And you will have used Axe Core without knowing it. So if you've ever gone into Chrome Dev Tools, so you've gone to More Tools, Developer Tools, and gone to the Lighthouse tab and ticked the accessibility tick box and click Generate Report, that uses Axe Core. And the Web Accessibility Checker task I showed you before also uses Axe Core at the heart of it. But before I do continue, I do want to say that automated testing should be used to complement manual testing. It's not a replacement for manual testing. As Manuel Muchowitz says, if a site is reporting as 100% accessible in automated tools, it's then ready for manual testing. And if someone states that their site meets a certain level of conformance, so on our recommendation is that sites meet WCAG 2.1 AA, then every criteria at that conformance level must be met. So Axe only finds 57% of WCAG issues automatically, and Lighthouse even says that you need to do manual testing, and we saw Visual Studio say that you need to do manual testing. So I do want to quickly show you Cypress. So Cypress is installed using Node. So the command to run Cypress is npx Cypress. Cypress has two modes that it runs in. It runs in headless mode and in desktop mode. In headless mode, the command to open it is npx Cypress run. And in desktop mode, the command to open it is npx Cypress open. So I'm just going to show you the desktop app. Whilst that opens, I will take you through what happens when you install Cypress. So when you install Cypress, you'll get a 4 folders added to your file structure, a fixtures folder, and this just contains the test data that you want to run, some sample integration tests, and these are always integration tests are always run from the integration folder, a plugins folder that lets you extend Cypress, and a support folder that will let you extend Cypress as well. I've had to hide the support folder because it returns false errors in Visual Studio. So I'll just take you very quickly through accessibility through a test. So the test naming convention is the file ends with a .spec, .spec name, and it's written in JavaScript. So you describe what's in the test suite using the describe option here. So this is running accessibility tests, and you say what the test is doing. So here we're saying it should have valid HTML. In Cypress, I will show you that now. Cypress is loaded, so we can see that we've got the different browsers we can run those tests against. These first 3 browsers are the browsers on my computer, and this last one is a default browser that ships with Cypress. If I just start the test, you'll see it launches the test runner. And at the top of the screen now, we've got a green tick box that will show you how many tests have passed, a cross that will show you how many tests have failed, and up here you'll see how long it takes to run the tests. This is a command log, so it's showing you what's happening as the tests are running, and you can see that it's started the accessibility test suite. It's validating the HTML for the page, and on the right hand side you can see what the DOM looks like at the point the tests are run. Now the test is completed, you can see that it's failed, and we've got a big long list of errors to resolve. And this HTML validate test doesn't just test whether there's missing end tags, it tests how many H1 tags are allowed, script integrity, and does some basic accessibility testing for you. So it's a nice test to add, and that test is added by using the npm package Cypress HTML validate. And the command to run it is cy.html validate. So the Cypress API is exposed using the cy variable, and anything off the API is accessible after the dot. And this package extends HTML validate. The Node package manager does document this package really well, and it's quite a simple package to install. Next package I wanted to look at was one that you may have come across, like I said, if you've run Chrome DevTools, and it's Cypress Audit. And this comes with 2 commands, cy.pally to let you do the accessibility test, and cy.lighthouse to run the lighthouse tests. This I'll show you very quickly here. So what we've got is the accessibility test. So we're saying visit the URL and run the accessibility test, and then we can actually customize the lighthouse audits to say what level of performance it needs to have to pass, what level of accessibility it needs to have to pass, and so on. And we can pass that into the lighthouse test and run that. The lighthouse test, once it's run, will return a lighthouse report like this. So you've got a nice report at the end of running the test of things to go and resolve. Obviously, I've run this against my local computer, so it's got a very low performance score, but and you will get different performance according to the environment, but it's a nice test to have. It does produce a lot of pages, so it's probably not something you want to run across the entire site, but it may be something you want to explore adding for key pages. And the final audit I wanted to show you, the final test option that I wanted to show you was Cypress Acts itself. Now, Cypress Acts is only compatible with Cypress 6.8.0. There is the latest version of Cypress is 7.4.0. And the test itself is you have to inject acts, so you use the cy.inject acts API call. and then you need to run the check accessibility call on it, cy.checkally. This is slightly more complicated to configure, but I will show you the basic tests here on the smoke test page. So as I said, the goal was to use a sitemap to validate the accessibility. Now, Cypress yields its results, it doesn't return them. And this has meant when I was trying to use the sitemap, I had to load the sitemap as part of an environment variable right at the startup. So we can see that here, where I've started the page. We can scroll up a lot on here. So this is reported every page that's in the sitemap, and that's been parsed and read into the Cypress variable pages, and you can have any environment variable. If you were to do it at any other time, because it's yielded when you read the sitemap, it's very hard to work with. So I've created that, and I'm going to, excuse me, then because I've stored it as an array, the first thing I need to test is that the array, it is an array and it's not empty. After I've done that, I can then set up the viewports. And the nice thing about Cypress and using this test method is we can have different viewports to emulate different screens and different devices. And this is important because different devices will have different accessibility failures because the layout adjusts according to your device. So once we've got the URLs back, we'll validate the HTML. And then we'll iterate over the viewports and check that the viewport and the URL is accessible. We inject the ACKs and then we check the accessibility on it. And then that will only log to the console. To get it to log to a report that you can then work with, I recommend looking at this pull request from Chit. They've gone a long way to working through the validation errors, and then by getting it into using the error reporting that they've developed, you can then get it into a Mocha Awesome report, and this will report on the failures, and it will show that there's different accessibility violations. So here we've got 8 for an iPhone and 9 for a desktop. So it will show you the different violations. It will grab a screenshot of what it looks like at that point in time and give a good detail on where the error is. So that is something that we can use for developers, front-end and back-end developers, to validate the HTML. But again, we want to look to put it into Azure DevOps. And the way our Azure DevOps process works at Nexer is we do a commit to GitHub. This then triggers the build pipeline. And all the build pipeline does is output some artifacts. And then when the artifacts, when the QA asks for a deployment, our Nexer QA asks for a deployment, we'll deploy it using the release pipeline, and we'll deploy it to the Nexer test environment. And then the QA will pass that. And then once they've passed it, it'll go to the client test environment. And when the client's happy, we'll put it live. And the reason for creating one set of artifacts right at the start is we've got one known source of truth, so we can guarantee that what's been built is what gets deployed to live. And we want to do the same with the test process. We want to make sure that what we're testing aligns to that process. So the way I've implemented that is I've split it out, one into the build artifacts, into the build pipeline, and then out into the release pipeline. In the build pipeline, what we've got is the normal publish your build, publish your website as normal. And then that's followed by a creation of the test zip file. So we're pulling out all the Cypress configuration and tests, putting that into a zip file, and then pulling out all the package information and putting that into a zip file. And then that will create 2 artifacts. So we'll have the artifact for the website and the artifact containing the tests. Then in the release pipeline, once we've completed the deployment task, we need to have the test tasks. The first thing you would do is extract the package JSON, then extract the test files, create a Cypress file, and this is specifically for testing it against your environment. Install npm, so that'll runs the npm install task against everything that was in the package JSON. Then run Cypress using the run command, because we want to run this in headless mode, and tell it to have the reporter as JUnit. And then because we've used the JUnit reporter, we can publish the test results. Finally, we've got the test results here, so we can see this is a completed deployment, and we can see that we've got 2% of our tests are passing, but 40% of our 40 tasks are failing. And we can click in to view those, and we can assign those tasks to be dealt with. So we can view more about the task. Unfortunately, Azure DevOps doesn't really support Mocha, so all you know is that there were some violations that were detected and you need to go off and do a bit more investigation, but you've got the information, enough information to make a start, and you can then assign that bug or add it to an existing bug using your Azure DevOps flow. So Azure DevOps helps support testing there. Finally, I do want to say deployment isn't the end. We do have to make sure that the type works for our users, so we still have to go back and do our manual testing. Need to make sure that it still works for switches, for voice technology, and all kinds of assistive technology. I want to emphasize again that we need to work with our content authors to make sure that they know how to create accessible content. And just want to say a massive thank you all for coming. I'm going to be at the Unconference at 12. If you've got any questions, I can answer them now, or you can reach out to me on Twitter. Thank you very much.